So this is two lessons in one. The first lesson is called Water in the Air. So they started talking about humidity. So humidity is the amount of water vapor in the air. And as you can see from this graph, as the temperature increases, so does the amount of water vapor. So I actually took this graph from Edgenuity because I couldn't find one that I liked better. It was actually a pretty nice graph. So you can see as the temperature is increasing going this way, the amount of water vapor in the air is greatly increasing. Dew point. So you may have heard them mention the dew point on the weather, on the news. The dew point is the temperature when water vapor condenses to liquid. So we're going to go over the water cycle again, but dew point has to do with condensation. So I pulled up this graph because in the summer especially they talk about dew point because we're talking about humidity. And dew point is a really good measure of how it's going to feel when you walk outside. And they have these little emojis to show that once you get to a dew point over 70 degrees, it's downright gross. So I thought that was cute. Here's the water cycle again. Of course, it's going to go from evaporation to the clouds and condensation. The cloud becomes heavy and you have precipitation, and around it goes. So here are the three again. Evaporation is when the liquid turns to water vapor gas. Condensation is when the water vapor gas turns to liquid in the clouds. Then when the clouds become too heavy in precipitation, they fall back to the earth. So this lesson then gets into clouds. So there's four types that they talk about. So there's the cumulus clouds, either the big puffy clouds, and typically there's going to be some fair weather out there. Cumulonimbus, when you add that nimbus to the end, it means a storm is coming, and typically a thunderstorm. So that's when those big puffy clouds start to get really dark and you have the gray sky. Stratus, these clouds are like big sheets up in the air. If you ever see them, they're not big and puffy anymore. They're like sheets or like a blanket, and they'll cover for miles and miles and miles. The last type is the cirrus. They're very wispy, and a lot of times they're made of ice. I've heard before they're like a horse's tail. They're very wispy. So I have this picture here, and I added an elevation because that was mentioned. So if you have the word alto in front of a cloud name, so cumulus we know as big and puffy, but if you put alto in the front, it's telling you where that big and puffy cloud is going to be. An alto would be a mid elevation. Cirro, if you have the word cirro, that would be a high elevation. So cumulus again are a big fluffy. If you put cirro in front, that means they're higher elevation. And then you can do the same thing with stratus, alto, and cirro, and then strato as well. Precipitation, the four types are rain, sleet, snow, and hail. I did not put a description of rain and snow because I think you know what they are. Sleet is when the rain freezes in the air and it's going to come down. I think you probably know sleet as well. Hail is when it actually freezes many, many times up in the atmosphere. And then sometimes those can almost come down as balls of ice. Sometimes they'll hail as big as a golf ball because it's frozen so many times in the atmosphere. Our next lesson is air masses and fronts. This lesson was a little bit more complicated, so you're definitely going to want to take notes. So air masses. So air masses are these large bodies of air, and they have similar temperatures and similar amount of moisture in the air. So they're similar. There's two types. There's the continental mass and a maritime mass. Continental has continent as the root because continental air masses are over land. Maritime, those are going to be over water. So then looking at two other categories are cold air and warm air masses. So cold air masses could be over land or over water. So putting this all together, a cold air mass that's continental would be over land. Then adding the word polar is what makes it cold. So continental over land, polar means cold. So continental polar is a cold air mass over land. Maritime polar. Maritime means over water. Polar means cold. So maritime polar is a cold air mass over water. And then they have, if you ever see a weather map, they have these abbreviations, lowercase c, capital P, and lowercase m, capital P. Very similar for the warm air. The continental maritime tells you where these warm air masses are, and then tropical is just the clue for warm. Polar is cold, tropical is warm. So then this would be a picture that would have some of the masses. So you can see the polar ones are going to be farther north, near the North Pole. That's the P. The tropical ones, the warm air masses, are going to be down here near the equator. And then you also have the ones over the water would have the M for maritime. And then the ones over land would be continental with the C. Oh, and there's a CT as well. Fronts. So there are 4 types of fronts. So we've learned about air masses now that are warm and cold and over land and over water. Now fronts are where they meet up together. And there's typically going to be precipitation that comes. So a cold front, not to be confused with a cold air mass. This is now a cold front where air masses meet. So a cold front is going to be cold weather. It's also going to be stormy weather. They happen very quickly, and it's when the cold air is moving, and it's going to be going under warm air. Typically, warm air rises, so the cold goes under, but the cold front is when the cold air is moving. So they're going to be pretty quick. It's going to be cold and bring in storms. A warm front. So this time, the warm air is what is moving. It's still moving over the cold air, though the warm air is always going to be on top. It's just what is moving. So warm fronts are going to be more gradual. They're not going to be as quick as the cold fronts. They're going to bring some warm weather, which is why they call it warm. You might have some drizzly rain, not the huge storms like a cold front. 2 other types would be occluded and stationary. So occluded fronts are going to have lots of precipitation, lots of snow, lots of rain. So this is when a warm air mass gets caught between 2 colder air masses. You have colder air mass, colder air mass. The occluded front is going to be in the middle where they're getting caught between those 2. The warm caught between the 2 cold. And stationary, this is when warm and cold air meet, but they stay separated. They're not passing over each other. So stationary is going to bring you cloudy, wet weather. So I just have some pictures of these fronts. And first I wanted to point out, if you're ever looking at a weather map, a cold front is going to be shown with blue triangles. Mrs. Cobb, I think, said that they remind her of icicles. So that's a good clue. And then warm fronts, you're going to see a half circle that's red. Maybe think of like the sun for a warm front. So you can see the cold front. Again, you're going to see the warm air rising for both. And then you're going to see in the cold front, the cold air is moving. In the warm front, the warm air is moving. Cold front, colder weather. Warm front, warmer weather. Then the occluded front. So this is where you kind of have them caught in between. So you can see the occluded symbol has blue triangles and red half circles because the warm and cold front, the warm front is caught between the 2 cold air masses. Then stationary, you can see the symbol slightly different. They are both on there, but you're going to see the cold and warm are coming towards each other and staying. So then the half circles are on one side, the blue triangles are pointed the other direction. Last thing is the cyclone and the anticyclone. So cyclones, if you've heard of those before, you know they have something to do with wind and air movement. A cyclone is going to happen in lower pressure. An anticyclone is going to happen in higher pressure. Cyclones is where air rises and meets, and you're going to get some rain. You can get pretty heavy rain. Anticyclone is the higher pressure. So higher pressure, the air will sink and move apart. So 2 words I like that they brought back in these pictures is that the low pressure is converging, so they're meeting. We learned about that back in the fall. And then high pressure is diverging, so it's moving apart, bringing you that drier weather.